Okay, recording has commenced, everybody. So thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. Just before I pass to Victor, I'd just like to welcome you all on behalf of Weld Australia. We are the peak body for the welding profession in Australia, and we have a range of activities around training, engineering, certification and qualification, advocacy. We provide a number of events throughout the year. There's a lot of resources, there's technology, and if you would like to if you have any questions about any of that, please do reach out to any of our team. We'd be more than happy to speak with you. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for the webinar, Victor Blaine. Victor is our Executive General Manager for Engineering at Weld Australia, and we're delighted to hear what you're going to be sharing, Victor. Just as a couple of housekeeping matters, could I we'd like to welcome anybody who has any questions throughout the session. Please either raise your hand on Zoom using the button or put it into the chat, and Victor will be pausing at times through the presentation to address your questions. Today's session is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be emailed to everybody next week. We invite you to have your camera on if you would like, but please maintain your sounders off unless it's time where we're inviting questions. So Victor, across to you now. Thank you very much, and we're excited for what you're going to share.
Thank you very much, Danielle. And thank you, Vanessa, and the Tasmanian State Committee as well for organizing and selecting the topic for today. I think it's a good one. We receive a lot of questions about the qualification of welding operators. So it's a great opportunity to clarify what are the requirements under ISO 14732 and sort of the benefit of using that standard. There's many application standards that do not cover this topic very well. And as anyone can imagine, the skills required for someone doing manual welding is very different than someone who's operating a mechanized or automatic welding unit. So it does make sense to have a different approach in terms of qualification. And that's what the standard provides for us. Something to clarify before getting in the details as well is this presentation is based on my opinion. So if anyone is interested in an official interpretation of the standard, please follow the official channel with Standards Australia. So you can actually contact Standards Australia if you want to request the official interpretation of the standard. So ISO 14732 is not a new standard. The first edition was in 1998, so it's been around for a while. As the year goes, there's been a few revisions, and there's been a recent revision. And also it's recently been adopted as an Australian standard, Australian New Zealand standard by Standards Australia, hence the AS&ZS ISO 14732. So that's very recent. That was on the 10th of September. So it's about 3 weeks ago it's been adopted. So it specifies the requirements for qualification of welding operators and weld setters for mechanized and automatic welding of metallic materials. So as we can see, first of all, the scope is limited to metallic materials. And here I've put in green a few key words that will go and look at the definition of those words, because that's very important to understand the scope of the standard and how this standard works. The standard does not apply to personnel who do not control or adjust welding parameters or are not involved in the setup of welding equipment. We'll understand that a little bit better when we look at those definitions as well. It has the notion of a job knowledge and also a functional knowledge test. That is where there's a big difference with the manual welding qualification. So if you look at ISO 9606, qualifying welders for manual welding, the job knowledge is not mandatory. In this case, when it comes to welding operators and weld setters, there's a mandatory functional knowledge test. We'll get in the details of this, but we can already think how it makes sense as basically the person operating the system. It's not the skills and competency of that person is not so much in terms of the dexterity of manually welding, but it's more focused on understanding the welding unit that they are operating. So starting with those definitions, so what is mechanized welding? So it's welding where the required welding parameters are maintained by mechanical or electronic means, but manual adjustment of welding parameters by the welding operator during welding is possible. Then automatic welding is welding in which all operations are performed without welding operator intervention during the process. In this case, manual adjustment of welding variables by the welding operator during welding is not possible. So looking at a few examples to better understand this. So in terms of mechanized welding, would be these processes where you can change, potentially adjusting the travel speed, the torch angle or positioning during welding, or the welding parameter. So for example, if you use GMAW solid wire and it's tractor mounted, that would be mechanized, because as the welding is progressing, you may adjust the positioning of the electrode, potentially even the travel speed or some parameters. Submerged arc welding, in most instances, is a mechanized process in the same way. Orbital TIG as well, when you can also adjust some parameters during welding. Resistance spot welding, especially when the operator manipulates the electrode location, is a mechanized welding process. And then when we go to automatic welding process, you can also have TIG orbital, but it's with the units where you pre-programmed all the parameter and there's no input from the operator. Similar with submerged arc welding. In some rare instances, it can be automatic. Basically, if you have a fixed automated station and from the start to the finish of the welding, everything is controlled under a PLC, that would be automatic. And then pretty much any welding process that you put on a robot. So you could put GMAW solid wire on a robotic system. Resistance spot welding could be on a robotic system. TIG, laser beam welding, electron beam welding. There's many welding processes that can be automatic welding processes when put on a welding robot. Then still in the definitions, so what's a welding operator? What's a weld setter? That's very, very important as well to understand the scope of who needs to be qualified. So a welding operator is a person who controls or adjusts any welding parameters for mechanized welding or automatic welding. And a weld setter is a person who set up the welding unit for mechanized welding or automatic welding. So for example, when I mentioned mechanized orbital TIG and the operator can change the setting during welding, then that would require a welding operator qualification. But for the orbital TIG process, if it's all pre-programmed, it's a pre-programmed cycle from start to finish, there's no manual adjustment, then that would be a weld setter qualification. Basically, if the person is starting the process, monitoring the process, and can intervene as required. Typically, that will be your operator, welding operator. That person is responsible of the outcome of the process. As the weld setter is the person that would only program or set up the machine before production, not having any control or monitoring during welding. Now, most of the questions we receive is related to this. So I'll give four scenarios so that we can discuss each of these scenarios, which qualification would apply. So, for example, if we look at a scenario where someone is loading the parts, pressing the button, the welding happens, unloading the part. If there's no setup, there's no monitoring of the welding, that person does not need any qualification under ISO 14732. However, scenario number 2, if that person is involved in the setup of the equipment, they may open the gas, adjust the gas flow, select which program will be used, potentially select which jig or fixture will be used, then that's a weld setter. That person is also setting up the welding unit. So a weld setter qualification is required. Then the third scenario is if that person is involved in starting the welding, but also monitoring and troubleshooting during welding, real-time control. It could be understanding the different error that can come up with the sensor. It might be running out of gas, of shielding gas, might have a collision, might have an issue. The system needs troubleshooting, or someone is monitoring this. That's when it becomes a welding operator. And that's where it would be a welding operator qualification. And the fourth scenario that I think is important to mention is people say, what about the person who programmed the robot? So someone will have programmed everything in the robot, where the torch will be moving, the speeds, everything. So basically all the offline programming, all the programming by a person who's not present at production setup, who's not present during welding, that person does not fall under any of those two definitions. So basically that programmer does not need any qualification. It's only if that programmer would be involved also in the setup of the equipment that then it would fall under those definitions. So I think that's important to clarify, and I wanted to bring those four scenarios because most of the questions we get about this is related to understanding who needs to be qualified versus who does not need to be qualified. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit on that. Before we go, any questions about these definitions, the scope of the standard, who needs to be qualified versus who does not need to be qualified? And as Danielle mentioned, if anyone has question, please raise your hand at any time and we'll handle the question as we go. I think we have is that a question? Mr.
Yeah, hello, Thompson.
Thompson? Yes. How are you, Thompson?
Yeah, I'm fine. Thank you, instructor. Right now, I'm in a wedding workshop. I would have want to ask this question. Can't the welder also do the work of operating at the same time, be the weld setter? Can't the welder, when as carrying on the job by yourself, you do the weld operator and also be the well setter at the same time?
I'm not entirely sure I understand your question, Thompson, but let me try to rephrase and let me know if I understood correctly. So you have someone who do manual welding, but is also involved as a weld setter, and you're wondering if he also need the weld setter qualification if he's already qualified for manual welding. Is that your question?
Yes, that is my question. Already you
Sure.
are already a manual operator and you can do the whole of this job. Do you also need a well setter's qualification again?
That person, yes, also need the weld setter qualification because some of the requirement of ISO 14732 are not covered in manual welding. The main one would be that mandatory knowledge of the welding unit.
Okay. Okay. So that is compulsory. That is what I find out now.
We'll get to the testing and extent of testing and discuss that a little bit more as well. But the short answer is yes, that person would also need to have a welding setter qualification if that's part of what they do. Okay. Now we're going into the section about qualification. So diving a little bit more into how do we run this qualification. So similar to manual welding, it's required to follow a work instruction based on or following directly a preliminary welding procedure or a welding procedure in accordance with ISO 15609. So noting here that it is acceptable to use a preliminary welding procedure. So you don't need to necessarily qualify the welding procedure that you want to follow for your welding operator qualifications, but you need to have that document so that there is a clear instruction of what is required to be done. And for the welding operator or the person undergoing the qualification to have all the necessary information. And here we're looking at an ISO standard, so that's why it's referencing to the ISO standard associated with the writing of welding procedure. So ISO 15609 has a few parts depending on the welding process. Part 1 for arc welding, Part 2 for gas welding, Part 3 electron beam welding, and Part 4 for laser beam welding. And also I didn't mention as an example, but this will also cover stud welding. So stud welding has its own ISO standard as well, ISO 14555. So basically you need to have a welding procedure or a preliminary welding procedure. The qualification shall be supplemented by a test of the functional knowledge of the welding unit. There's an annex about this. I'll cover this at later stage today, but that's very important. That's one of the key difference between qualifying for manual welding versus qualifying welding operator or weld setter. That Annex A is normative, so all the content including in that annex is mandatory requirements by the standard. And here qualification can be supplemented by a test of knowledge related to the welding technology. That's in Annex B. Annex B is informative, so it's only for guidance, but it includes the recommendations for a welding technology test. Typically, we'll look at this as well briefly at the end. Typically, that would be already covered by what the person would have learned at trade school, for example. So for the qualification, the welding operator or weld setter who performed the welding procedure qualification test is also qualified in accordance with ISO 14732. So what that means is the person basically who welded the WPQR, you can use that same test to meet the standard of ISO 14732. Again, you need to be careful that you still need to meet all the requirements and have that functional knowledge of the welding unit test and still issue welding operator or weld setter qualification certificate. But that's one way in terms of the welding of a test piece and the extent of testing. That's an acceptable way of qualifying that person. Then in terms of what is required for testing acceptance criteria, it will be different depending on the welding process. As you can imagine, the acceptance criteria for resistance welding versus arc welding would be very different. So it's broken into a few sections. So to start with, we have fusion welding, which would be the most common welding processes. So in accordance with ISO 9606 corresponding part. So basically the qualification testing and acceptance criteria can be on a test piece in accordance with ISO 9606. So for example, the question that was asked just before, someone can do their extent of testing weld sample the similar way as a manual welding, but with this mechanized or automatic welding unit. And then ISO 9606 will define what extent of testing. So for example, visual and ultrasonic testing or bend test for butt welds. And then for fillet welds would be visual plus fillet bright or 2 macro examinations. And then ISO 9606 also has different parts. So the first one for steels, the second part for aluminium, third part for copper and copper alloys, part 4 for nickel, part 5 for titanium and titanium alloys, which by the way, the TC44 committee is working on the new edition of ISO 9606, where all the parts would be combined into one document. So that's with A. And then when you look at the second option, B, so that's for tube to tube plate welds in accordance with ISO 15614 part 8. So this typically, these tube to tube weld plate would be, for example, with the orbital TIG I mentioned before. That would be quite common. The ISO 15614 part 8 is the standard defining the qualification of a procedure for tube to tube plate welds. So basically in this instance, you base the extent of testing and acceptance criteria on that standard. However, you only need to do visual testing, NDT for surface breaking defects, so PT or MT, and 1 macro. So that's the extent of testing that is required. Then there's another option for overlay welding in accordance with ISO 15614 part 7. So again, the test piece will look different, will be different. The extent of testing will be what can be done for those types of welds. So here it's similar, it's visual testing, a surface NDT. So may that be PT or MT, depending on the material. And then macro examination typically. The last option here is based on pre-production or production test pieces. This is a very interesting option because when you have mechanized welding or automatic welding, in a lot of cases, you may have a large volume of the same parts. Normally you say, okay, I have 100 of these parts to do. So then you use a mechanized or automatic welding process. So you have this repeatability, you do your programming and setting up, and then you can go and you know, produce serial production at a high volume. So a lot of the time, it's interesting to just basically do your testing on your first part. Basically, you have these parts that you will do 100 of. The first one, you may as well just do all the testing, including destructive testing. So you may want to sacrifice the first part to confirm that the welding process is qualified, everything is working well. It's a good way anyway to confirm your programming as well of the part and everything. And that's used a lot, especially with automatic welding. It saves you basically doing a different test sample. You can just go directly with the start of your production, and the first item that you produce, you will do your testing on that one. Then the qualification. So for the other processes as well, resistance welding, arc welding, stud welding, laser beam welding, electron beam welding, it all sends you back to the standard of qualifying welding procedure for those processes. But then it's streamlined a little bit the extent of testing. So resistance welding here, the test piece in accordance with ISO 15614 part 1213. So part 12 is the qualification of procedure for spot, seam, and projection welding. So in that case, typically you would do visual testing and shear test. Part 13 is for resistance butt and flash welding. So typically you would do a visual testing and bend test. And ISO 15613 is the pre-production test I already mentioned. And basically here with resistance welding, you could decide to do a visual testing and macro examination on the pre-production test as well. Then arc stud welding in accordance with ISO 14555. The ISO 14555 standard already has its own requirement for qualifying stud welding operators. But within those requirements, it actually mandates ISO 14732. So it sends you to this standard as well. And in that case, typically you weld 10 studs. You do the visual, and then you do the bend test where you do the 60 degrees bend on the studs. So you see that basically it sends you back to the test piece of qualifying a welding procedure in most instances, but streamline the extent of testing. Now, with these qualifications, similar to manual welding, once qualified, it gives a range of application, a range of welding that this person is now qualified to do. This is where there's the biggest difference between the requirements of this standard versus manual welding. Basically, the range is much wider. When it comes to manual welding, the material grouping will limit what a person can be qualified for manual welding. The type of weld, is it a butt weld or a fillet weld? The deposited thickness, the outside pipe diameter. There's a lot of essential variables for manual welding where the skills, the dexterity of the welder, the welder will need a different skill. As when it comes to mechanized or automatic welding, it's more about the usage of the welding unit than really what the welding unit is doing. And that's why this range is much, much wider for a welding operator or a weld setter. And that's where there's the main benefit of using this standard, because if you qualify following the range of manual welding, welding operator, you may need them to do a whole range of different qualification, where actually they may have needed only one qualification as a welding operator with that welding unit. For example, you may weld steel, and then may weld stainless steel, even aluminium. That person won't need separate qualifications for all the separate material grouping, which can save you a lot of money and a lot of time when it comes to personnel qualification for welding. So here I've put these variables in a table. In the standard, they're all written as paragraphs and text. I think it's a much easier way to look at this in a table. So let's have a look. So basically any change of these variables would require a different qualification and a new certificate to be issued. So the first one here is a change of welding process group. So that's your first two digits in the ISO 4063 classification. So if you completely change your welding process, basically you need to requalify. And then there's two added requirements to this. So when it comes to TIG welding, so the process is starting with the first two digits, 1-4. If you change from autogenous welding, so with no filler metal, to doing TIG with filler metal, you still need to requalify. And basically the addition of the filler metal, it changes the technique, the coordination, the setup of the equipment. So that's why it needs a new qualification. The next one is change from submerged arc welding with strip electrode to any submerged arc welding, solid wire or tubular cord electrode, or vice versa. In a similar way, so this would require a different feeding system, potentially different flux recovery system, joint geometry, and that's why it requires a new qualification. A change from direct visual control to remote visual control and vice versa. That's for mechanized welding. So basically, if you're controlling your process by directly looking at the arc, the weld pool, the joint, versus if you have a camera and you're monitoring this through a screen, it changes the reliability, the operator, how they judge the arc and assess the weld in real time. The bead behavior can be different. So that needs a requalification. The next one is deletion of automatic joint tracking. So this is for mechanized welding. So basically it changes also the reliability of the process. The operator might manually compensate for positioning the torch or the electrode for joint tracking in real time. Or the setup as well. The setup, the weld setter might need a setup that is a lot more precise if there's no joint tracking, versus the setup could be yeah, a little bit more permissive if you have the joint tracking. The next one is the deletion of automatic arc length control for similar reasons. So if you're mechanized, the operator might need to adjust the arc length visually. It won't be done automatically. So it requires a new qualification. The next one, a change in the welding unit when it affects how the setup is performed and or how parameter settings are entered. I think it speaks by itself. So that's the main reason also why you would requalify someone. The next one is change from single run per side to multi-run per side technique. So basically, if you do a single layer weld or if you do multiple run, this also changes the skills that you need. Basically, knowing how to position the electrode on the multi-run weld, how to manage interpass will be different, so it will need a new qualification. And even for the weld setters for automatic welding, how to set up the joint for these multi-pass welds will be different. For orbital welding, a change from welding in a single position to welding in multiple position. It affects the control and the complexity for the operator. So typically here when we say a single position would be when the pipe or the tube would rotate, versus multiple positions when the equipment would weld and rotate around the pipe. The next one is the deletion of backing. So the backing will influence the penetration, the bead shape, will affect the process control, the parameter adjustment. So that's why it's essential variable for mechanized welding. And the same with the deletion of consumable insert will affect the root quality. There's the same reasoning here with mechanized welding. So here you can see that these essential variables or range that applies to qualification are very different than those for manual welding. And they're really not as restrictive as the ones you would find for manual welding. It's more oriented on the welding unit and the competence needed for that welding unit and welding process. Any question on those variables and the range of qualification?
Yes, Victor. It's Andrew from Barrows.
How are you, Andrew?
Regarding the deletion of backing, does that include the gas backing and change of gas backing? Especially when you're reloading. Did you hear me, Victor?
I can hear you. I'm thinking, Andrew. I would need to verify for you. I think it only says deletion of backing. I would need to go and verify. That's a good question. What I can do is at the end of the presentation, I can quickly have a look and then answer your question, Andrew.
Oh, thanks, Victor.
Any other question on the variables and range of qualification? Okay, now going to the period of validity. So here there's a lot of similarities with qualification for manual welding, but we'll see that actually the period of validity is longer in this instance for the welding operator and weld setter. So similarly, it starts with the initial qualification. This is from the date of welding, so it's not the date of issuing the certificate, it's the date of welding of the test piece. And then the method that is chosen for the extension of qualification shall be stated on the certificate at the time of issue. That's important because we'll get there the next slide after this, but there's different methods for revalidation. But you can't select one method and then if you're expired, you then decide to change to a different method. You need, at the time of qualification, to define which of those methods is applicable. And then you need to stick to the validity related to the method you've chosen. I'll get there on the next slide. Now here we have confirmation of validity. So similar to manual welding, there's the validity period where you need to revalidate your welder. But within that period, every 6 months, you need to confirm the validity of the qualification. So basically, the person responsible for the welding activity shall confirm the qualified person successfully worked within the range of qualification 6 monthly. So during each period of 6 months, the person responsible for welding needs to confirm that the qualified person has worked within the range of qualification and that was compliant production to any application standard, basically, that the project may need to meet. So that's similar. That should not be a big surprise. That's similar to the qualifications for manual welding as well. Then you do every 6 months, you do that confirmation. But then you need to also revalidate at one point. Here, you have 3 options. The first option is to requalify, basically you redo the same qualification 6 years later. So compared to manual welding here, instead of 3 years, it's 6 years. So you see that it's a longer validity period. The option B is every 3 years, 2 production welds made during the last 6 months of the validity period shall be tested by volumetric NDT or destructive testing. So here, typically, if you don't do those volumetric NDT as part of your production requirements, you go with the option A. But if you already do those volumetric tests, you just use those to do the revalidation as per option B. And here there's option C, where the qualification can remain valid as long as the qualified person works for the same manufacturer. The manufacturer's ISO 334 quality requirements are proven by verification, and they are documented evidence of the producing of acceptable welds based on application standards. I personally don't promote this option for the simple fact that some client specifications don't accept this. Some application standards also don't accept this in rail or defense, for example. And I think it's not that much to ask every 6 years to requalify. It's a good refresher, good thing to do. Yeah, and the standard has a clause about revocation as well. So if the person responsible for welding has any doubts or reason in terms of the ability of the qualified person, the qualification can be revoked. It's required to issue a qualification test certificate. So the examiner or examining body shall confirm that the qualification is complete and successful. The identification of the welding procedure followed, the variables used, and the range shall be recorded. And the certificate shall be issued under the sole responsibility of the examiner or examining body. Now here, any change of the essential variables outside the range of qualification would need a new test as well as a new certificate to be issued. Here, it's a bit small. You might not be able to see this clearly, but it's just an extract of the Annex C of ISO 14732, which gives an example of a qualification test certificate. So it's a good example that you can use if you're developing your template for this. Okay, now time is running fast, but I think we'll make it just in time. The last two things I want to cover are those knowledge tests that I mentioned at the start. So basically here, we're looking at the functional knowledge of the welding unit. Very important again, because that's a mandatory requirement of the standard. It's a normative annex, so all the requirements in that annex are mandatory. And basically the knowledge of the qualified person shall have to ensure that the procedures are followed. And this is mandatory to be documented as well. So you need to document that training. The annex will outline what's required to be included in that training. So for example, welding sequences and all procedures in the relevant process. So basically recognition of welding procedure requirements and the influence of the parameters, joint preparation and weld representation. So basically to understand the conformity of the weld joint preparation to the WPS, cleanliness of the fusion faces, weld imperfection, so to understand being able to identify the visual weld imperfection related to the process being used. Welding operators or weld setters qualification, so it's mostly just to understand the range of their own qualification and what it means. Welding unit and process operation. So of course that's key here. It will greatly depend on the different welding process or welding unit being used. But that could include, for example, jigs and fixture setup, control systems, the knowledge of programming, at least not necessarily writing the offline program and all, but just the handling of the qualification tests that could be with selecting the correct program. So the welding operator selecting a program. Yeah, so basically you need to look at this Annex A. You need to look at all the content and make sure that you have a functional knowledge test or assessment, and that you document this, and that's part of the qualification. And then the Annex B, this one is only recommended, it's not mandatory, it's an informative annex. And basically it's recommended and should be supplemented with additional subject as applicable. This here would typically be also what can be learned at trade school or through experience as well. Yeah, and for each of the items I have there on the slide, in the Annex B, it does describe a little bit and give some example of what could be covered under those topics, what could form this welding technology test. So that's it for the presentation today. I went a bit quick potentially towards the end, but I'm conscious that we only have 5 minutes left already, and just want to give a few minutes if anyone has questions to finish the webinar. So if anyone has any question, now is the time.
Okay. So
Yes.
how do we obtain the qualifications?
So depending on So depending on the country where you are, there may be different requirements. There may be different examining body present. But technically, if you look at the standard and its requirement in your company, the person responsible for welding, for the welding activity, so your welding coordinator, can basically run those qualifications for your personnel. So you can basically do those qualifications yourself.
Yeah, but I think you can use this qualification to work anywhere. It's the same thing with AWS, AWP, CWB.
So
You understand this plan, Pauline?
it will depend on the
The
certifying
American
body.
Welding Society, American Welding Program, Canadian Welding Bureau. With this qualification, you can use them anywhere.
Unless it's required for the qualification to be done by inspection body, then yes, you can do it yourself and use it
Yes.
anywhere.
So if I want to do it myself, so how do I get the qualification?
Well, typically, this would be managed by a company who has the equipment, and complete this welding. So basically, in your company, you would have some welding operators or welding setters, and then the person responsible for the welding coordinator in the company, would then qualify the personnel in the company who are working as welding operator or welding setters. So you can't really by yourself get qualified. Typically, it's more something done by the employer.
Okay, I understand. Yes, most of the qualifications I have was done by most of the companies around here. But
Typically, be
what
the
I was trying
employer.
to do, yes, by the employer. Sometimes when you are being qualified, you can be employed to do job for them, depending the job and the specifications of the job procedures. So, but I'm looking at the variables and the range of your qualification in this world, Australia. I'm beginning to love the dynamism. But at the same time, I'm looking at just like some of the programs I've run in AWP, American Welding Programs. There are some of the programs I've done there. And with their program, it is versatile. You use it anywhere. If you have opportunity to go, you can be supplied in any company in the world. And if they're interested in you, they have to call you. So I'm looking at this, what you have given to us. You have defined a lot in the management of the procedures of welding, which are part of my job. And I was like looking at in these qualifications, is it only be done? You must come with a company. Don't you have the theoretical part here where you can run the program, just be certified document with document?
Well, this could be run as a program, but then the company running the program would need to have these welding units, and undertake the qualification. Look, it's not
Okay.
it's not a standard practice that I'm aware of. Typically, it's always with the employer because they will want to qualify the personnel to the specific welding unit that they have, and specific range, that is needed for their company, and then they will run the qualification of their welding operators or welding setters.
Okay. understand. Thank you.
Danielle, I think we're on time. Already, it's already 2:30. Yes, I would leave it like this unless, do we take just one last question? If anyone, we can check if there's one last question.
Yes, if anybody does have a final question, if you'd like to raise your hand, put it in the chat, or just unmute and ask Victor, we'll take a final question. Thank you. Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat or any hands raised. So to wrap up, thank you everybody for attending. A special thanks to Victor for your presentation this afternoon. It was really useful. Also wanted to extend a thank you to Vanessa Skipworth and the Tasmanian State Committee of World Australia, and we appreciate their activities. At the beginning, Vanessa did ask if anybody had any other topics for future webinars that you would like to see. We would love to hear that feedback from you. Please feel free to put it in the chat or to unmute or to send us an email, but we're certainly open to hearing of any other future topics that you would like to hear from us on. So again, a big thank you to Victor. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you everybody for being on board, and we'll conclude the meeting now. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you,
everyone.
Victor.
Thank you, bye.
Thanks, Victor.
Thank you, Victor.